I'm a diplomat by training, so you check the boxes. You know, you're trained basically to say something when there's nothing to say, and nothing when there's something to say. You're always between a cliche and an indiscretion for the most part. And since I'm not asking for anybody's vote tonight, I don't care. So we can just have an open conversation about it.
The United States was the only superpower. We were unchallenged and unchallengeable. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Latin American writer, and I'm sure many of you have read his works, he came to see me when I was the commander of troops in Panama and in Latin America, and he said, in 1996, he said, "It's very boring in the world today," he said, "because there is today only one ideology, and it is the ideology of democracy and capitalism. There is no other way." And a wave of democratic reform swept Latin America. It swept Europe and into Eastern Europe. And at the same time, in America, we had an explosion of technology and telecommunications with mobile phones and the internet, personal computing, and we signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, and China came out of the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 and rejoined the world community economically. And there was an explosion, a global opening, which created something called globalism. And in America, we created 22 million jobs. Hundreds of thousands of young people from around the world had converged on the United States to try to understand the mysteries of American capitalism and Silicon Valley. The stock market was at record highs, and there was no challenge to America as far as the eye could see. And then 9/11 happened. And now people look back on the last 10 years and they call it a lost decade. 2 wars, 6,000 U.S. military dead, probably 25,000 wounded, maybe a fourth of that seriously. $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion in hard costs, another $1 trillion or $2 trillion in costs that will have to be repaid eventually to veterans and others as a result of the expenses of the war. A foreign policy that was distorted, and an economy that didn't grow, a national deficit that's $1 trillion a year, national debt as far as the eye can see, unemployment. The United States hasn't kept up with the growth in its own labor force. And on the horizon is China, now the second largest economy in the world, 10% economic growth for 30 years, asking others, has America failed? And so I look at it and I say it's not just about what you do abroad that gives you strength. I go back to what General Eisenhower said, the strength of America isn't the strength of its armed forces, it's the strength of the American economy. And so in 2012, a strong American foreign policy begins at home with a strong economy. We've got to create jobs, we've got to deal with the deficit, and we've got to create a new vision for what America is in the 21st century. We're no longer the nation guarding the world against the relentless spread of communism. But what are we? And that's the challenge that your generation has to help us solve.
So I look at it somewhat historically. Yeah, I was born in 1960. We exported $3 for every $2 we imported. We own 36% of the world's GDP, science, technology. Seems that every Nobel Prize winner was from the United States of America. 25% of our economy was fueled by manufacturing. And I look at where we sit today, Wes, about 9%. We're in the middle of the Cold War. You know, we all knew the rationale for our foreign policy strategy when I was growing up. Defense spending, balance of power politics. It was all couched very conveniently around the Cold War. And that gave way to the War on Terror, which, you know, we can talk about a little bit later. We've been through 10 years of that, and I'd say this nation has about had all it can take. We're ready to get out of Afghanistan. We're ready to get back on our feet as a nation. And I would say there's a void all of a sudden in front of us as Americans. It was convenient during the Cold War. It was convenient during the War on Terror. You could make an easy description for why we spent on defense as we did, or why our foreign policy strategy was the way it was. And wow, now we're kind of staring into a blank, a void. And I think that the next leader in this nation, whomever that will be, Wes has tried, I've tried, we're probably too smart to ever try it again. But the next leader, and you all, as the generation of emerging leaders, you will have to define what fills that void. Our nation's future is how well prepared we are as people to rise up and to meet the competitiveness challenges of the 21st century. And they're intense. And that's about economics, and that's about education. And it's going to play out over the Pacific Ocean in countries I've lived in before. I've lived over in Asia 4 times. And I have seen what the other side of the world is doing to prepare for their future. And I would humbly submit to you that if we don't get our act together, and you will be part of getting our act together, you in the audience who are wondering when your day will come, if you'll ever have to worry about these issues, your day will come. It will come a lot sooner than you think. If we don't get our act together, we'll see the end of the American century by 2050. And there's no reason to see that happen. No reason at all to see that happen. Finally, let me just say, we've got everything a nation would ever want to succeed. You know, I've watched this from 10,000 miles away in Beijing. Where you walk the streets of Beijing, you walk the streets of Shanghai, walk the streets of Guangzhou, and there's energy. Blue sky. You know, their time has arrived in China, so they think. But there are a lot of underlying tremors that we can talk about later. And you reflect on this country from 10,000 miles away, and you say we still have all the attributes that any nation state would ever want to succeed. We just don't see it in ourselves sometimes. We're stable. We have rule of law. Now, how unique is that in the world today? We have the longest surviving constitution in the world. Greatest colleges and universities. A creative class. Entrepreneurs, innovators, the envy of the world still. What's China trying to do? Trying to crack the code on innovation. What's Singapore trying to crack the code on innovation? They can't figure out how to get it done. And we have a pretty darn good armed forces too. I think the best this country has ever seen. So I would submit to you, we've got a little work to do ahead. Your generation will be part of it, but never lose sight of the fact that despite our problems, we have all of the raw material, all of the ingredients this nation needs to get back on its feet and move forward.
We don't know. I said, was there new intelligence? Did he have something to do with 9/11? They said no. I went to Senator Graham, who was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I said, Senator, I don't understand. You're read into everything. I'm not. Is there something new? He said, no, there's nothing new. And then I went back into the Pentagon in November of 2001, and one of the 3-star generals called me into his office. He said, sir, you're not going to believe this. It's just a memo here. It says, we're going to go into 7 countries in 5 years. It's going to be Iraq, then Syria, then Libya, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and eventually we're going to take down Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, don't show it to me. And so I've never actually seen the document. It was just a concept paper. But they weren't thinking about the politics of it. I'm in the office with the planner and the Joint Staff, and I said, okay, this is 2002. We know we're going into Iraq. We know we're planning. It's what we've done in the United States Army since the end of the Gulf War in '91. We did nothing but war game what to do against Saddam Hussein, how to get to Baghdad and so forth. Yeah, but where's the political piece of it, of what happens when you get there? So I was asking one of the 3-stars, I said, where's your phase 4 in the plan? He pointed up at the ceiling to the office of the Secretary of Defense. He said, they won't let me do it. So you go back and read the books carefully, you'll find that when Colin Powell and the State Department tried to get the Pentagon to plan for what would happen, the Pentagon, under Secretary Rumsfeld, basically sort of fended him off. They went through the motions. They knew, because Rumsfeld is an incredibly smart guy who's a real inside player. And he knew that if you ever unpacked the end state and listened to the things that John Huntsman just told you about Iraq and the post-Cold War era, that nobody would support going into Iraq, just like President George H. Bush And Brent Scowcroft didn't support it in '91. They knew it was a bag of worms. It was going to be an impossible problem. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you want us to talk about personal experience. That's the personal experience piece. Please, when you get in a position to influence this, do not believe that when you drop the first bomb or you send the soldiers in, they can solve the problem. It's too hard for diplomats. Let's send in the military. God, if I've heard that once, I've heard it a dozen times in government from people who don't know what they're talking about. Hey, call on the military. Can do. Yes, but the lesson is you've got to think before you act. And you've got to use all the power of diplomacy and economic strength and have a vision for where you want to come out before you decide to commit the first soldier or the first aircraft to combat. And if you don't, woe be unto you. You'll be picking up the pieces for a long time. And that's unfortunately what I think both of us are saying up here about Iraq and Afghanistan.
Never let it be said that you can't step up and help, or that you can't redo something that we just continue doing for the sake of doing it. Never let it be said that you can't step up and change Congress by getting term limits, or fixing the way we finance campaigns, or fixing the revolving door where members of Congress become lobbyists, or fixing a banking system that is too big to fail. These are all domestic structural issues that I would argue are part of fixing our core before we can really be successful from a foreign policy standpoint. That's your generation. And so we've packaged up this thing called humanity that's the best we can do, and then we pass it down to you, and you've got to go to work on it.